All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started so we can be respectful of everyone's time. I will keep an eye on our waiting room and add folks as they knock on the door. But I just want to start by saying thank you so much for making time for this today. We are recording, so just be aware that this is going to be recorded and shared out more broadly after this. I want to say thank you so much for coming today. I'm Adrienne Jameson. I'm the Executive Director at Community Action of Southern Indiana. And our work is really focused on improving quality of life by addressing the root causes of poverty. So, why are we hosting this panel? Well, we know there are literally hundreds and thousands of nonprofits who are focused on improving the quality of life, and they all do something a little bit unique. And unfortunately, for a lot of nonprofits, access to really high quality legal support is not always available. And I know we're always looking to recruit legal counsel to our boards and to find funding for them that may still be out of reach for some organizations. So with that said, I'm incredibly grateful to our three presenters today who are generously sharing their expertise. Alyssa Cochran of Frost, Todd and Brown, Mark Toffick of CLLB Law, and Tim Stuckey of Keitlinger and Gray. So, Alyssa, I'll start with you. Do you mind just sharing a little bit more about your legal work and what types of nonprofits you work with, either professionally or personally as a volunteer?
Yes. So I've had an opportunity to work with multiple nonprofits as a volunteer on boards. So I've worked probably over the past 8 years with several different nonprofits as a board of directors member. I also, as an attorney, advise nonprofits and provide general kind of governance recommendations, help with nonprofit filing applications, and overall nonprofit compliance. And so I'm happy to be here today to speak with everyone about what I've learned in this process.
Thank you for being here. Tim, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Tim Stuckey. I'm an attorney here at Keitlinger and Gray. My practice is primarily around personal injury and insurance defense litigation, but I have a background in housing and landlord tenant law, as well as civil rights issues. I kind of came into this by being thrown into the water, as it were, representing the Jeffersonville Housing Authority and Family ARC. And then I got to sit on a board, which I'm currently on, the board for Community Action of Southern Indiana. So I've kind of got to see both sides of the coin, and I'm just very encouraged by the work that we do. So I've continued to do more of it, and happy to be here.
Thanks, Tim. And welcome, Mark. Tell us a little bit about your practice.
Mark Toffick. I am one of the partners at Church Langdon Lop and Bannett here in New Albany, Indiana. I started as a public defender, and I think that kind of gave me a lot of insight into people and circumstances and situations. So once I was able to join private practice, I was able to kind of understand, hey, I still need to give my time to these organizations. Most of what I do is spent defending people in lawsuits and litigations, understanding claims and risk and analyzing those and taking those to trial if they need to go to trial and dealing with that. So that's day to day. I've been able to find a couple organizations that I really enjoy working with, and I find their purpose and their mission kind of in line with what I want to do. So right now I'm on the board of directors for Leadership Southern Indiana, on their executive committee. I do a lot with One Southern Indiana, and then I work with the ACLU and the Arts Alliance of Southern Indiana, which are all great organizations. I was on some other boards, which I've learned a lot from in the past, and it's been a great opportunity to get back.
Awesome. Thank you so much. For our folks tuning in today, we have some structured questions we're going to go through on three kind of big areas. Board roles and responsibilities, I think, is a huge one that nonprofits struggle with or would like some more support on. We're going to talk a little bit about managing risk for your organization, and then we have some hot topics that are just kind of timely that we'd like to address today. If you have questions for the panelists, please feel free to put those in the chat and we'll work to get them here in the schedule. I'll keep an eye on time and we'll try and prioritize those where we can. But to kick us off with board roles and responsibilities, Tim, less experienced board members may not understand the legal responsibilities associated with their role. Can you provide just a high-level overview of what these are and why it's important to understand them as a board member?
Certainly. So, at its core, being on a nonprofit board is about stewardship, right? Board members occupy this sort of position of trust. And with that comes a set of essential legal formalities, or a certain set of legal duties, as they're called. And there's really just four main principal ones. And you'll hear these duties mentioned if you ever have to go through board training, and when you're brought onto a board and you're sort of going through that initial period. And those four duties are the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, the duty of obedience, and the duty of confidentiality. So just kind of breaking those down, what each of them are. So the duty of care means you got to do your homework as a board member. You have to approach your board service diligently. And that includes preparing for meetings, asking informed questions, reviewing, if you get the meeting minutes and the agenda or the past minutes for the past meetings, means you go through those thoroughly. You're not just glancing at them at the meeting once you get there, right? You've taken the time and you're educated about where the organization stands. And that also means you're staying current on the organization's governing documents. So if there's a bylaw, things like that, you're keeping in touch with all of those, whatever the organization's internal policies are. The duty of loyalty is really the individual member has to act in good faith in the best interest of the organization. You're not taking actions or making decisions that will benefit you, or maybe if you own a business or you work for a company, it's not going to benefit that company, right? Those decisions are for the best interest of the organization. So when there is a potential conflict of interest, even if it's an indirect one, there's a duty there to disclose those conflicts of interest. And so transparency is really going to protect the integrity of all board decisions, and the way that it's going to afford that protection is by board members disclosing when they do or do not have conflicts of interest. The other one is the duty of obedience, and that means that you're going to keep the organization grounded in those essential documents, keeping them true to their bylaws, to their internal policies, making sure they're not taking decisions sort of outside of those documents. And then also, like, a lot of organizations have mission statements or value statements. You're keeping the decisions that the organization takes in line with what those mission statements are, what those value statements are, and you're not sort of operating outside of the bounds of those governing documents. And finally, and I think it's probably the most important when you're working for a nonprofit in a small community like Southern Indiana or Louisville, and that is the duty of confidentiality. And oftentimes it's overlooked, but it's very important. Board members are receiving a lot of sensitive information, financial, proprietary, employment, personnel issues, and that information has to be protected. So even unintentional breaches of confidentiality can damage trust. And we're building, if you sit on a board, or if you're an attorney for a board, you're representing the agency, that you're the public face of the agency. So, damaging the reputation to a public agency in a small community by breaching confidentiality could have unimaginable consequences. And so that's why that duty of confidentiality is there, and it is so important. And a lot of times there's policies that govern that, internally, but confidentiality is definitely one of the most important duties. But ultimately, taking sort of all three, all of these duties together, it's more than legal compliance, right? It's about approaching your role as a steward and being diligent in that approach.
Yeah, I love the summary you gave there of really focusing on stewardship, making sure you're acting in the best interest of the organization you're serving with. I also heard you mention there the bylaws as kind of your core governing document. And Alyssa, you and I work on all sorts of documentation things together, but tell me about any tips or tricks you'd give to organizations who are crafting their bylaws to set it up for their own success. This is something we can choose. So what should that look like?
Yes, thanks, Adrienne. So one thing that I will start with in talking about bylaws is just an overall understanding of the fact that nonprofits are governed by state and federal law. And so in Indiana, there is a numerous code provisions that set out sometimes requirements, sometimes options for how nonprofits should operate, and bylaws are referenced there too. And so under Indiana code, a nonprofit is required to have bylaws, but it's very broad in what those bylaws can include. It's simply anything that relates to regulating or managing the affairs of the nonprofit organization can be in the bylaws pursuant to Indiana code. Um, as long as nothing is inconsistent with what's in the law. And so that is essentially a catch-all for saying your bylaws will govern unless Indiana code says something differently, then the Indiana code will govern, or federal law or some other provision. But in thinking about putting your bylaws together, I always encourage nonprofits to look at what they actually need. Your bylaws do not need to be complicated. They should be something that anyone can understand. So instead of copying bylaws from a different organization or just downloading something from online, that can be a good starting point. But look critically and say, is this practical for our organization? And one example I give are committee structures. Some nonprofits are heavily dependent on committees that either plan major events or manage an ongoing program. And those committees act very independently from the full board. If that is how your organization operates, your bylaws should be much more detailed about the procedures for creating those committees, who will serve on those committees, who reports to the board from those committees, what the committee has authority to approve versus what would still require full board approval. But if you have a nonprofit that rarely uses a committee structure, you may not need anything in your bylaws other than a provision that says the board can create committees if they want to. You don't need necessarily all the other procedures. Your bylaws are also going to cover the basics of officer roles, term limits, how your board members can be removed. Indemnification, which is going to be when the organization is going to defend you or the directors if they're brought into a lawsuit. And that's something that's also set out in Indiana code. And so if you had in your bylaws, we never are going to indemnify anyone for anything, no matter what the circumstances are, that would not be enforceable because that would be inconsistent with the indemnification requirements in Indiana code, which have some optional requirements, but some mandatory requirements if a director is wholly successful in defending a case, for example. So look at your bylaws from a practical standpoint. What does your organization need to function and operate? And for anyone new coming into the organization to understand this is how we're going to approve things. This is how we're going to manage the ongoing business of this organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so don't back yourself into a corner with rules you really don't need. You don't need. We have a lot of
The
rules.
longer and more complicated, the more likely they will not be followed, which leads to other problems.
Right. You're good as long as you're following your bylaws and Indiana federal laws. Got it. And what about board minutes, Alyssa? These are presented in lots of different ways. What are your recommendations as far as what should be included and what should be left out?
So your board minutes really need to reflect the activity and the decision making for your board. They do not need to be a transcript or a complete narrative of every aspect of the discussion that occurs at a board meeting. The purpose is primarily so if someone requests to inspect documents or if the board is trying to remember when we had a discussion, when we approved something, the minutes are going to reflect when that happened, who was there for the discussion, and what was decided. And so it's fine to put in your minutes, there was a discussion about this topic, then there was a motion, a second, a vote, and it was approved or not approved. Another thing to think about for minutes is always executive session and what is kept for or reserved for executive session where there is going to be a much more confidential discussion about a particular topic. Usually that's going to be sensitive personnel discussions, financial discussions, if there are any kind of audits that the organization is working through, and legal matters or other types of crisis management issues that may come up for an organization. At that point, you can go into an executive session and you can vary on whether you want separate minutes for your executive session or if you want to simply reflect that there was an executive session and this was the topic. Again, it's good to keep, you need to keep some record of, yes, there was an executive session. This is who was present for it. And this is the general topic that was addressed. It can be very basic. It can say, legal matters, personnel discussion. But if it is a very sensitive topic that you know is going to lead to a significant decision or action on the board, I would typically recommend you keep separate executive session minutes that reflect a little bit more of that discussion, just so you have a record of what was addressed. And then those minutes have to be kept confidential between the people present for the executive session. So if you have executive session without your executive director present, when you circulate those minutes, don't circulate them to everyone. The regular minutes would be circulated to everyone at the board meeting. The executive session minutes will be circulated just to the people at executive session, which means you might have a board member who needs to be responsible for maintaining that record if your records are usually maintained by your executive director. So those are some major things to think about with keeping minutes and kind of balancing regular meeting versus executive session.
Excellent. Thank you, Alyssa. Mark, tell us about some of the biggest governance mistakes board members can make or boards can make. How can we prevent these with clear policies and onboarding?
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Adrian. I'm looking at Catherine, and all right. So I think the biggest thing is you want to make sure the people that you're bringing onto your board understand the mission, they understand the goals, and the bylaws are going to kind of give you that framework of how to get to those goals and how to move that ball forward. And I think that's the most important part. I think a lot of that is, the boards I've been on, you kind of learn as you go a little bit. You have your onboarding, but there's no way for them to cover kind of everything or go through, the rules of order and how things are approved or what needs to be approved or how it's approved. It's kind of one of those learning processes. But I think just focusing on, hey, here's what we're trying to do, here's how we're trying to do it, and having that continuity and consistency within your board, whether that's leadership from the actual organization or just on the board from the volunteer side of things. And I think it's just people have to kind of understand the details, but not get lost in them. So, hey, here's what we're doing, here's how we want to do it. But make sure that the goal and the mission of the organization is at the forefront. I work with a board and they're very good about once a year, you're going to have a board meeting as part of a bigger event. And it kind of reinforces that to the board every year to say, this is what we're here for. This is what we're trying to do. These are the goals we're trying to accomplish. And I think it's really helpful for us as a board to see that. And it's just a great reminder, of the onboarding, of the mission, of the goals.
Excellent. Yeah, I think anytime you can bring your decision making back to your mission, it's going to get a little easier. All that kind of disgruntled decision making can be set aside because we're all here for that same purpose.
Right.
Tim mentioned this earlier, but I'm wondering if you can speak on it a little bit more, Mark. Conflict of interest in a really small community, which we would be considered, right? Everybody knows everybody. It's a real thing. And if you recruit board members, they likely sit on another board, and that's okay. But how should we be managing conflict of interest?
You've got to be upfront. I mean, with your board and just say, look, we understand you're here. We understand you might be a lot of other places and you might be related to a lot of people or know a lot of people or went to high school or college or whatever with them. But I think it's just breaking that down to them and say, look, we want you here on this board because you're going to help advance that purpose. Conflicts are going to happen. I mean, there's no two ways. Different organizations will be going for the same grant. Different organizations are going to be, trying to have an event on the same date or trying to do this or trying to do that or trying to raise funds or get funds out of some whatever it is, it's going to happen. So I think telling your board it's not a problem. You just need to tell us about a conflict or understand what a conflict is. I mean, just having that education piece, because they might say, oh, this is a conflict. Well, they might not understand, like attorneys do, what an actual conflict is, what rises to the level of a conflict of interest. But I think just telling your board, and we do this on a few organizations I'm with, we send out a conflict of interest form every year. And it just kind of keeps at the forefront for you to say, okay, well, let me make sure I'm doing my due diligence here and saying, all right, what could potentially be a conflict here? Where's the gray area? And if there is a gray area, letting your board know there's people to talk to. Someone can help walk you through this in a completely confidential setting. I've been on boards before where we're worried about a conflict of interest and we get brought in just to have that conversation, completely confidential. No one really knows about it. We just want to have that conversation just to put everyone's mind at ease. And 9 times out of 10, it's not a conflict. We go about and we appreciate that, that was brought up, but we're able to go on with that. So I think just understanding what a true conflict is. And then, I mean, at the end of the day, there are a lot of conflicts that can be waived, and we can kind of figure that out if we need to. But if we don't know there's a problem, if we don't know there's a potential issue, we can't really do anything about it. We can't really address it. So just being transparent, being upfront, and understanding what this community really is.
Yeah. So raising those potential conflicts. If you're not sure, ask. Always a good policy to follow. Tim, I think in hearing this discussion, a lot of board members might think, oh, there's a ton of risk. I need to know everything about everything. And that's a lot of ownership for a volunteer to take on. So how do you recommend that boards think about their responsibility without overstepping into micromanagement?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting thing to think about. So I sort of think about it as a balancing act. The board is setting the direction. They're not setting the pace. And that means defining the organization's mission, its strategic priorities, ensuring there's accountability, and monitoring the progress toward all of these goals. But how the goals are executed, that is the role of the leadership team and the executive director. That is not the task that the board is tasked with. The board is tasked with sort of overall higher accountability. They're responsible for adopting the policies, but the executive director is actually going to carry those out and with the staff. And that's, but the responsibility begins with those policies that are adopted by the board. Another sort of key thing is to build the consistency and clarity into the relationship. And that is what, with the bylaws, with your mission statement, with internal employment policies, you outline how the decisions are made, what types of information are regularly to be reported to the board, under what circumstances board involvement is necessary. Regular structured reporting from the executive director or the CEO can give the board the insight that it needs to stay informed and to stay out of management's lane, right? Because there are clear boundaries and there need to be clear boundaries. And your policies and your internal governance documents can provide those guardrails. Another thing is do the work of oversight. The members on the board, they're tasked with oversight. So their job is, as I said before, to approach their role with diligence, come to the meetings prepared, review the materials that are given, participate in the trainings. We just had one here at Community Action of Southern Indiana that I attended. There's one that's going to be upcoming on fraud training, which is it can come up for different organizations. That fiduciary responsibility is not oppressive. It just means you have to understand the financial health of the organization, make sure that it's viable, and track its progress. You're not responsible for maybe all the ins and outs of the day-to-day operations. That's, the executive director, or if they have a financing committee, or however that those powers are delegated. But if something does go off course, it's the board's role to raise the concern and sort of help shape that solution. So again, we're talking about setting direction, not setting the pace. Another thing is just support your leadership, whether it's a executive director or a CEO, however your nonprofit is structured. Building that strong, trusting relationship with the person at the top is going to be key to maintaining the different lanes. The board holds the leadership accountable for the actions that are taken. The partnership is going to allow both sides to operate independently in their lanes without having the executive director sort of pressure the board on, what policies, or maybe, what, things like, what to do internally, day-to-day operations. The board's going to make that decision, but the board is not going to say, oh, executive director, you need to do this and this and this and this and this on a daily basis. That's, keeping that clear division, those guardrails is what's important. Another thing, kind of to Mark's point about the event, staying in touch with the mission statement, the board is to stay connected. They're not to control. Periodic visits to the site may help. I know we do at Cassie. Sometimes the board members will come to the annual meeting or the Christmas party, or just different events that are being hosted on site. Our role there is not to sort of take over the control of the organization. It's not supervisory. It's observational. We're there to stay connected with the mission, with the employees, with the goals of the organization. But the actual day-to-day operations, you leave that to the executive management team. And finally, going back to my other point about confidentiality, is operate with discretion. You're upholding a fiduciary duty, and that means you've got to respect the confidentiality portion. So whether it involves internal deliberations, or sensitive staff issues, or the privacy of the people you serve, you're going to have very confidential discussions in those executive sessions, in the board meetings. That information, it doesn't need to leave the room. And that can really impact sort of the actions that the organization takes. And so those are sort of my kind of overall thoughts on what board members can do and how they should think about keeping the separation between the two roles.
I think that's excellent. And I think that is one of those areas that nonprofits are always seeing kind of ebb and flow based on their leadership and who's on the board at any given time, and how people like to be engaged. And it really falls to the executive director, to the staff, to provide a consistent experience and boundaries, to understand what those rules are, and to give the board the information they need to make those really high level decisions. Those decisions have a tremendous impact on the agency. So keeping your board well informed is always one of those things. But I love the way you framed it as far as observational versus managerial. When you attend those things, we absolutely want board members to attend and feel really connected to the mission. You are our most public representatives of the work that we do very often. And Tim did judge our Christmas cookie contest this year. So he did pretty good.
Sometimes it's fun.
We hope it's fun most of the time, right? We know the board meetings can take a little while, so we want everything else to be a good time. All right, so we're going to kind of wrap that up with board roles and responsibilities. If anyone in the room wants to put a question in the chat related to that topic, please feel free to do that. But we're going to transition to talking about risk. Oh, that question that just kind of tightens your chest. So, Alyssa, I'm going to start with you. Where do you see nonprofits being the most vulnerable when it comes to legal and operational risk? And what are kind of some of the early warning signs that boards should be keeping an eye on?
So I think there are probably three main categories to think about with risk for a nonprofit. Ongoing operations and personnel risk. So just internal kind of disputes about how the organization's being run, disgruntled employees, hiring and firing decisions, internal policies, and if those are being followed, those types of things. Events, if you're having large events, that presents different kinds of risk, whether it's injuries or property damage or things like that that we're thinking about when we're thinking about having big events. And then financial mismanagement. So any type of organization is going to have to think about whether you're a nonprofit or not, what are policies and procedures in place for making sure the finances are properly accounted for, but nonprofits especially always keeping an eye towards our funds being used to further our nonprofit mission, which is why we have nonprofit status to begin with. So those are kind of the three buckets, and I think that for trying to manage those types of risks, the ongoing operational kinds of risk, just consistently updating your policies, knowing what those are, making sure everyone internally, whether it's your staff or your board, understands what those policies are. They're regularly checked, they're followed, there's good documentation that they are being followed and that people are aware of them. Probably the top way to try to avoid those types of disputes. Events, it completely depends on the type of event you're having, but always worth having that discussion of where are we having it, how many people are going to be there, who's responsible for what if something goes wrong, and who's going to have insurance coverage, and we can talk about insurance a little bit more, but that's always part of managing risk is there insurance coverage for it. It's not uncommon for there to be available special events policies, so you get a 1-day policy if you're having an event that has a special kind of risk, and also if you know of a risk, having waivers ahead of time if you have volunteers coming out to a location to do a big cleanup, and there's possibility that people could come into contact with broken glass or any unsafe substances during a cleanup activity. You're providing warnings about those risks and, like I said, potential liability waiver forms you could have people sign. So that's one way to manage. And then financial management, again, having good policies and procedures in place, making sure that your board understands the big picture of your finances. They don't need to understand the cash flow in and out every single day, but we know that nonprofit funding can be complicated.
Mhm.
And so understanding how your organization is funded for your board and designating that in your financial reports to the board in a way that's actually easy to comprehend is always a good safeguard to have in place. So what are things to watch for that might be, kind of red flags for the organization? I would just say generally complacency or a lack of engagement of your board. So if your board is coming to every meeting and just approving things without discussion, without questions, and every single meeting is just this rote like stamp approval on everything, you might need to think about how do we get the board re-engaged? How do we remind the board of kind of their responsibilities to be inquisitive and make sure they're understanding what's actually being approved? And good reporting mechanisms for any type of um, issue. So board members are the face of the organization. And so oftentimes if someone is unhappy with how the organization's being run, whether that's a staff member, a volunteer, someone in the community, they're going to pull a board member aside and say something to them. Your board members need to know what to do when that happens. If it could very well be a friend or an acquaintance. And so they might acknowledge that person's concern, brush it off and never bring it up again until it becomes a bigger problem, or gets brought up to someone else, then suddenly it's a discussion and you're saying to your board members, well, actually, someone told me about that 6 months ago and I just didn't do anything with that information.
Mm.
So your board should know kind of what's our procedures. And like Mark said, in the context of conflicts of interest, if there are complaints or concerns about the organization, just have the discussion, make everyone informed. Your executive director is definitely going to want to know because they're the head of the organization too. So just have an open discussion, decide, even if the end of that is we aren't going to do anything about this right now, but at least everyone's on the same page. Or maybe we do make a plan for how we want to address that concern or make some sort of internal policy change because of that concern. Um, but best to not just brush those things off. Um, and inevitably, when that happens, it does end up becoming a bigger issue down the road. So,
Right. We want to get ahead of things.
yes.
And as an executive director, I never want to be surprised. Please tell me if you hear it, let me know. Um, you mentioned insurance. So rapid fire, every organization looks different. It's a big difference if you're running a hospital versus childcare versus in-home services. But how should organizations evaluate what type of insurance is best for them? What's most critical?
Right. Having very candid conversations with your insurance agent about how you're operating and what services you're providing is your first line of defense to identify the most important insurance coverage for your organization. Every organization is going to have some sort of liability protection, but like you said, it depends on are you operating out of a location that you own or someone else owns who's insuring, that premise. But at a minimum, like I said, you're going to have some sort of liability protection, directors and officers coverage that will protect your board from potential lawsuits. And then whether your organization needs some additional layer of employment coverage depends on how big your staff is. I mentioned the special events coverage. That's always something to consider if you're having big events with especially hundreds of people attending, and what that looks like. But nonprofits have to constantly weigh the cost and benefit, and that is insurance, right? There is always some risk. You are not going to make your organization completely risk proof. It would not be affordable to do so. So I would say most importantly, you're having those discussions on an annual basis about what your insurance coverage is. Everyone needs to know generally what that would cover. As a board, your board should understand. But even having a small committee or one person on your board that's designated to be having that ongoing discussion with the executive director or your insurance agent. So it can be updated as necessary, but really targeted towards these are the activities we carry out. Where is our biggest risk? Our financial risk, and you can help, evaluate and build your coverage around that.
Mhm. Right. And then the other side of this, so we're gonna, like you said it, we can't make ourselves risk proof, but we're gonna try really hard through our policies. So, Mark, what would you say are the most important policies for an organization to have in place to help mitigate some of that risk?
I'll be honest, I think Alyssa read my mind because I wrote down events, personnel, and finances. Those are
Excellent.
the three main points. I mean, you have to have those policies in place and outlined and followed
Mhm.
to protect the board when it comes down to protect the organization when it comes down to it. I mean, from an event standpoint, I've been to every nonprofit event there is, I think, from, stuff with the governor to, a party in a field, whatever it is, all these organizations are going to have these events, they're going to have fundraisers,
Mhm.
and just making sure you have a policy in place for what you can and can't do, how you can and can't do those things, and making sure your board is on the same page so that someone doesn't kind of take it too far or maybe open the board up, or open the organization up to some risk that they just don't know about or they don't appreciate yet. Personnel is the next one I put down. I mean, I think it's very important to have a hiring and a firing process. And you're going to have these personal improvement plans, whatever it needs to be, for current employees, just to make sure, the organization is covering their bases when it comes down to those things. The nonprofit world, as I've seen it, there's a lot of turnover, and there's also a lot of turnover to other nonprofit organizations. So making sure not only that you're protected internally from, some issues with your staff or whatever might be going on, but also them moving on to a different nonprofit and maybe, taking some of the stuff you wouldn't want them to take with them, or working in that same space, and then they become competition. And I think having those policies in place is really just going to protect you all. Finances, I always want to make sure there's someone smarter than me handling these finances and dealing with these. I mean, I went to law school for a reason, right? Like, do not trust me with the numbers. Happy to look over. Please, let's make sure we have someone that knows what they're doing, that is accountable, that is just looking at the books in the fiduciary capacity, not to sway the board any which way, just to say, hey, here are the numbers. This is what's coming in, this is what's going out, this is where it's going, this is where we're building, this is where we're losing, etc. I mean, looking at those financial statements every month is very helpful for a board, just to see that, and it provides a great level of accountability for the organization when it comes down to it. And then I wrote down one more just in case. I mean, I don't know, it's come up, I think, a lot more lately. It's just a lot of organizations work with minors, and just making sure there are policies in place to protect the organization, to protect the board, whether that's just having a little more oversight when minors are around, or making sure two people are in the room at any one time, or not leaving people alone, things like that. And it's best to have those things written down. It's best to have that understanding. It's best to have that on your onboarding. There's just been a lot more lately that we've seen, and we want to prevent and protect when it comes down to it. So those are what I see as the biggest ones.
Excellent. Yeah, I would completely agree that conversation around minors, there's just a few places where when you're evaluating risk, you should always kind of hear something and go, oh, are we covered? Transportation is one of those, events is one of those, working with minors, it just changed the conversation. So you need to be prepared to adapt. We have a question in the chat, and Alyssa, it's for you. You've talked about the importance of thoughtful, practical bylaws and accurate meeting minutes. Can you explain how these documents can help insulate individual board members from personal liability, especially in the event of a lawsuit or financial dispute? Are there other mechanisms to help insulate individuals from the liability an organization may have as a whole?
So I think I'll start with kind of the negative reality of litigation that I have to often break to people, that nothing will stop someone from naming you in a lawsuit. So it doesn't matter if it is completely unwarranted or you have the best policies and procedures in the world. If someone decides that they are going to sue you for something, nothing can stop that from happening. So it is always a risk. But I will say that as a board member, there are several things that you can think about from a perspective of avoiding personal liability, and it is maintaining that distinction and that role of I am acting on behalf of the board, or I am pretending to be acting on behalf of the board when I don't have actual authority to do something, or I thought I had authority to do something, but it was not documented anywhere that I had authority to take this action. So as a board member, am I following the bylaws? Am I following the procedures? Am I taking official action at meetings rather than taking official action or presenting to take official action outside of meetings? Am I signing contracts on behalf of the organization? Have I been authorized to sign those contracts? So those are the types of things you want to be thinking about. And I would say for the most part, it's fairly clear when you're acting in the capacity as a board member, because you are, like I said, um, acting with specifically granted authority. Your minutes are going to reflect that. You want to make sure your minutes are reflecting that, or there's other communications that are going to reflect that. Um, Having designated roles of who does what helps with that too. So your bylaws might say, only the president and the executive director have authority to bind the organization to an enforceable contract. Only these people have authority to make commitments to write checks or something along those lines. So if you are not one of those pre-approved people and you're writing checks for the organization, it suddenly looks like you're not acting on behalf of the organization, but maybe you're acting on a personal behalf. So those are the big things that I would say as far as thinking about personal liability. But the risk, of course, always is there that if you are acting in any capacity on behalf of an organization, that you could be named personally in a lawsuit.
Yeah, I think that's also an interesting thing for executive directors or CEOs to be aware of. You'll hear folks say, "Oh, I have 12 bosses. How do I know what to do?" Really, you have one boss, and it is the board as a governing body. You shouldn't be taking instruction from a single individual on the board unless they've been provided that authority to take action or to give you. And so, yes, there's lots of risk. Acting as you're following your rules, your bylaws, and acting as a collective is what helps provide some of that insulation from individual risk. All right, now that we've scared everyone talking about risk, we're going to transition to some of our hot, timely topics. I'm going to start with Mark. Um, let's talk about it. So, a lot of agencies don't have the amazing legal support that Cassie enjoys, and it's expensive. How do you know where to start if you find trouble at your door? How do you find the right help?
You can start with your board, right? Even if you don't have an attorney on the board, maybe you have someone that is a cousin of an attorney, a friend, a coworker, whatever it is. Say, hey, board, I got a problem, or we need a solution to something. Does anybody know someone? This is a small town when it comes down to it. So someone's going to know someone, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, someone's going to know someone. And then even if they don't, if you come up empty, I tell people, reach out to an attorney or reach out to a local firm. You've got three really good law firms on this group chat. If you reach out to one of us, we might be able to help you to a point, right? Like I always tell people, I know enough to be dangerous about a lot of things. So if you give me a call, I can say, look, here's kind of a 30,000-foot view of a lot of things, or here is the general overview of it. But if it, kind of goes above my pay grade, I'm going to know where to send you and how to send it to you. Like I worked with a board for a while and they would reach out on a foreclosure. I know enough about foreclosures, but once it gets into, the next step, I say, that's it. I don't know anything else about it, but I list someone else from my firm and say, hey, here's someone to talk to. It might not be free after that, but here's someone to talk to that's a good resource, and they'll tell you what you can and can't do. Use your nonprofit status to your benefit and just say, hey, we just need some help here. Do you mind? And a lot of local places are going to say, no, we don't mind at all.
Thank you. All right, it seems
Agree. And I
appropriate.
would add,
Okay, Lisa.
in just thinking about what's out there resource-wise for nonprofits, I also am a really big fan of boardsource.org,
Mhm.
that provides lots of good articles and things like that about governance, about recommendations on bylaws, or any types of questions that might arise for nonprofits. So finding reliable resources that are free are really great too for a nonprofit, especially if you're just getting started and you don't even know what questions to ask. Just finding a website like that where you can peruse, the various articles that they have or frequently asked questions as far as operating a nonprofit is a really good option too.
I'm a big fan of Board Source. Spent quite a bit of time there. That's a great resource. It seems relevant to us since we are holding this panel via Zoom. Tim, for nonprofits starting to experiment with AI tools for grant writing, outreach, Like, how should we be thinking about that? How worried should we be about the note takers that are added to every Zoom call now? What's on the horizon?
Yeah, so AI is here and it's here to stay. um, I think we have to adapt as we know more, as we learn more about the different AIs that are out there. The first thing I think about is the what I'll go back to my duty of confidentiality, right? So you got to start by recognizing that the AI has a limit on privacy. A lot of these platforms will store the data and use it to train their AI. So you cannot assume that what you're putting in to the AI search engines or what have you, um, you cannot assume that that information is confidential. That becomes very important if you're putting things like donor lists or internal communications or some kind of a personnel record or your strategic plans. Those kinds of documents, you just now expose those, and it creates a serious concern for any organization that it has to keep those duties of confidentiality, has to keep the duty of care, right? That could violate those duties. The other thing is to understand the implications of what it's going to do, right? There have to be proper safeguards around how you're using the AI, and that goes to creating your internal policy for how AI is used within your organization. Are you using it for sort of background information to sort of create supplemental information, whatever it would be? Whatever you're putting in the AI, it's going to require a human eye to review. Nothing should ever be put in the AI and then just put out there for public consumption. A human should review absolutely everything. AI is notorious for giving false information. I had an AI, I used it on a case report, and it created facts out of nowhere. And it was like, that was not in the facts that I gave you. And I was like, where did you get that fact? And it apologized to me. It said, I'm sorry, I made that up. And it's like, yeah, you did. But who would have caught that if a human hadn't reviewed that? So, part of maybe in that policy, anything that's generated by AI, you're going to have a human review it. With the note takers specifically, you gotta worry about the policies, right? Because some of the things that you talk about in, like, for example, an executive session. You do not want an AI note taker taking notes on what goes on in an executive session, not only because that information is confidential, but because it could violate some other policy, right? So you want to have an internal policy that says it's fine to have an AI note taker on the public meetings that are available to the public, but for an executive session, AI note takers are not allowed. Or if it's like an internal Zoom call, like with a leadership committee, or a finance committee, you're talking about very sensitive, confidential information. So you're not gonna maybe want an AI note taker on that. So creating that policy, stating when an AI note taker is allowed, when it is not allowed, and then even if an AI note taker is going to take notes, is the output going to be reviewed? Is it going to be stored? Things like that. And you'll have to investigate each individual AI. A lot of their policies are online, and you can go to the individual AI websites and see sort of what their individual confidential policies are. Some AI tools do protect a lot of information from being used by the engine, to train its own AI. So you just got to kind of look at each AI tool individually on its own basis. And finally, with the policy point, train your team. So if you're the executive director, if you're on the executive committee and the board has adopted an AI policy, you better make sure every member of your team is aware of what that policy is, what it requires, and how AI is to be used. Because we're all using AI in some form. If you're on Facebook, if you're on, they've got, Grok now on Twitter, these tools are going to be here. So we just got to make sure that we're using them in the right places. We're watching how we're using them, and we're not sort of abdicating our position of authority over what does and doesn't come out. Because if you put information out to the public for public consumption, it's the human's responsibility. We're not going to be holding the AI liable here. It's going to be the humans. So just keep all of that in mind when creating those policies and moving forward if you use AI in your organization.
Right. I know we're kind of coming up on our time. I have one more timely topic I'd like to ask Tim about, and then we'll do some wrap up. And I see there's a question in the chat, but for many nonprofits right now, the most timely thing is how should independent nonprofits be evaluating new executive orders as they come out? There's more going on the nonprofit side than maybe previously. What steps should they take to respond or implement new policies to ensure compliance with those?
Sure. So we've recently gone through this with Jeff Housing. We're doing a little bit of it with Community Action of Southern Indiana, and I'm sure other organizations are facing it. So the very first thing, my recommendation, do not panic. We are only in the first few months of the current presidential administration. So you've got to take a step back and realize that it's a long haul. It's a long haul push, depending on where the government goes and how they structure the budget, the big beautiful bill, as it were, if it passes, it's just going to be one stepping stone to another stepping stone. So right now is not the time to panic. The sort of really first thing you should be doing is examining whether the executive order even applies to your organization. Look at what the executive order is, if it's attacking your funding sources, maybe it's attacking an internal policy regarding staff or your stakeholders or the people that you serve. Maybe it's attacking the operational scope. Not every order is going to impact every nonprofit. So you need to take time to understand what that executive order is actually saying. And that comes into sort of the next pieces, which is where you're going to have to confront the issue directly, and it's going to require most likely legal counsel. So legal counsel can provide you a lot of times, if you're the executive director or the executive team, they can provide you an analysis of whether or not the executive order is going to impact your organization. But you, as an executive team or as a board, you're going to have to get the facts and face the reality of whether or not the executive order impacts you, and then if it does, well, what are going to be the next steps? And you have to consult your legal advisors to assess whether the timeline supplying the orders or whether the risks or if we're out of compliance before we even start reacting, right? We've got to consult the key people on the team. The second thing is sort of to retrench strategically, have immediate conversations with the leadership team. So if Adrienne as the executive director, she's going to go to her key managers over her departments, come up and maybe strategize, come up with strategic plans and contingency plans to protect the sort of operational runway, as it were, because even though the plane is going to land, we've got to get that runway extended because we don't know how it's going to land, right? Nothing is truly final yet. And so another part of that is being transparent with the board of directors. So if the executive order has consulted legal counsel and legal counsel has said, hey, this executive order is going to impact you, you need to start creating plans, and the executive director with her team or his or her team has created those contingency plans, the executive director or the management team needs to go to the board and say, hey, this is the situation. This is what we plan to deal, how we plan to deal with it. This is what we're thinking, and just keep the board as informed as you can. Obviously, these things are happening in real time. You can't exactly have a direct line to every board member. So, maybe you have to call an emergency session for something that's really immediate. But otherwise, just kind of keeping the board regularly updated. If you can do that by email, by phone, whatever it may be, just try to keep everyone engaged. The next step is you got to plan for financial alternatives and the impact of the order. So you've got to assess whether the order is going to impact your organization and how much of a loss it's going to take. And you can begin by identifying maybe new opportunities for new funding, right? If we know our grant is going to be cut by the federal government, or maybe there's a private grant by some other entity, maybe we can apply for that. So that's where you've got to plan for new funding sources. Maybe you're going to grow public funding, public donations. What's the strategy around that? Bridge that gap with communication. Go to your stakeholders, go to your funders, the people that are donating to your organization on a regular level. Ask them for maybe gap funding. We're in a tight spot. We need just $5,000 more this month. Or for $9.99 a month, you can save the organization, whatever that looks like. You bridge the gap, right? And then when you've done all that, you can pivot. You can pivot no matter if we find out that an executive order is unconstitutional, we find out that this big, beautiful bill isn't going to pass, you're going to have to pivot. And if you've done all of these steps, you come up with the contingency plans, you're protecting your finances, you're staying viable as an organization, you're going to be able to make those pivots, make those changes. And you can build the internal capacity to adapt for those changes. And finally, I think you got to grow, right? You got to grow off of what you've learned. And so if you're as an organization, if you're addressing these changes on a daily basis, you're learning, right? You're learning what your organization can and cannot do. So if a crisis comes in the future, you're going to know what your organization has the capacity to do. But how would you have known that if you hadn't already gone through it? So just really take, as you go through, look back, take task on how did we get here? What did we do? What worked? What didn't work? Take that information to make the organization stronger as it moves forward. Because the likelihood is we are going to face organizations, nonprofits, they're going to face more instability. And it's not necessarily a positive or a negative thing, depending on which side of the political sphere you're on, but it is a change. And it happens with every administration, as it switches Republican, Democrat. It happens every presidential administration. And so we're going to have more presidents. We're going to have more federal government, more state government. There's going to be different stakeholders, different people in office. So there will always be change. So these sort of steps can help you sort of navigate that if it ever comes in the future and whatever that might look like.
Thanks, Tim. I love your metaphor of we're going to build the runway at the same time. I've been kind of saying we're gonna build the plane, we're gonna fly it, and then we're gonna build a boat just in case that doesn't work out. But I kind of like the runway. That's really nice. I know we're up on time. I want to let each of our panelists just end with something they'd like to highlight about an organization that they work with, something you're proud of or you're excited about. This is not a plug for those of you who work with Cassie. You are welcome to choose one of your many amazing partners, but that's a good way to end. So Tim, why don't you go first, and then we'll go Mark and Alyssa.
Sure. So I'll start. I've got three organizations off the top of my head. First one is CASA Floyd County. Every year they hold their Advocacy Rising Gala in April. I'm sure they will be hosting it in 2026. Highly encourage all of those who are listening to attend and to donate and participate. The second is Family Arc. They hold their annual breakfast. They do amazing work with women and children and getting the families reunited. I highly encourage those to participate in that. And then, of course, I have to shout out Cassie and their festival that's coming up, even though I'm not contractually obligated to say it, but I do encourage people to sponsor and to attend.
Thanks, Tim. Mark, how about you?
I do a lot with Leadership Southern Indiana. I'm really happy with what we're doing. We had a big pivot last year. We have a program that I don't know how many of you all are familiar with called Next Gen. Next Gen is for high school students. It's about mentoring them and giving them those leadership opportunities. And kind of, we ran into a point where we had so many applicants, but only so few spots. And the board had to kind of figure out, how do we do this? What do we do about it? Like, all these kids want to be in this program and want this mentorship and leadership. So it was about saying, okay, why can't we do two classes? Why can't we have two sessions, and working through it with the board, with the executive committee, with the directors and the stakeholders, and saying, okay, can we do it? Can we fund it? And can we do it as well as we're doing, the original? So working through that, being able to implement that, and this, I think we're on our second class now with two sessions, has been amazing. And we found some great people to come sponsor that. And I think it's just a lesson of, you don't know what you can do until you kind of talk through it. And it took a lot of conversations with the board, with the people, and with some high-ranking fundraising people to say, hey, can we get some money to do this? And it worked out really well, and I'm so happy about it. It's awesome for the organization.
Yeah, congratulations on the expansion. That is really exciting. All right, Alyssa, close us out with something great.
Yes, so I will give a plug for Down Syndrome of Louisville. I'm on their board. It is a fabulous organization. We just hired a new executive director, Taylor Ingram, and so we're super excited about all the new energy she's going to bring to the organization. But one of the biggest programs that I'm excited about that they have launched now is a preschool program for kiddos with Down syndrome, and it's been super successful. And we're seeing these kiddos just make great strides. And so happy that that is something that we're offering in Louisville at our location out there and expanding more and more into Indiana every day. And so there are more and more services like that. But Down Syndrome of Louisville is one of the biggest Down syndrome organizations in the country. And I have met people who have moved from all over the United States just to be close to the services that they provide from pregnancy through adulthood for families and for individuals with Down syndrome. So if you don't know about the organization, please go out to one of their events and see what it's all about.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I love seeing how each of you light up talking about these missions that matter to you. It gets me excited. I thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your expertise. Folks on the call, thank you for making time over your lunch, and I hope we all get to take something away from this. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.